In 1994, an armed uprising by the Zapatista National Liberation Army, or EZLN, took place. They claimed the return of their lands, a better distribution of wealth, and the participation of different ethnic groups in the organization of the state and the country. The movement arose from the discrimination and marginalization suffered by citizens in Chiapas. Zapatistas demanded work, land, shelter, food, health, education, independence, freedom, democracy, justice, and peace. But 27 years after this uprising, many of their claims have stayed unresolved. They resorted to dialogue after international pressure with the San Andres Agreements, which committed the state to recognize indigenous peoples constitutionally and guaranteed them autonomy. The dialogues also led to the founding of the National Indigenous Congress. However, the Mexican government did not respect this agreement, and many violent attempts to contain the EZLN were made. In response, the Zapatistas proposed the construction of their own autonomy instead of an armed conflict, and in 2003 announced the creation of Los Caracoles, which had grown to a total of 12 by 2019. The Zapatista contribution to suggest a new relationship with indigenous peoples in the configuration of a reform of the state evidences the insufficiency of the current Mexican legal framework that disregards rights and reduces the impact of others. So let's talk about the state, which is the Mexican government. The Zapatista autonomy is a decolonizing project in the sense that it destabilizes the concept of state sovereignty. We should understand that even though the Zapatistas are not asking the officially constituted power to change, by exercising power through autonomy and creating their own network of practices and social organization, which include new relations in terms of land and production, government, justice, health, and education, they are radically challenging the sovereignty of the state and the organization of space. For the Mexican government, Zapatismo represents an effort to establish counterpower. Furthermore, contradictions with the Mexican Constitution can also be a concern for the state, as the situation can trigger the polemic about whether the law differentiates between different types of Mexicans. Let's move on to understand the situation of the indigenous communities. The trade agreement threatens spatial dispossession and the identities of peasants, of indigenous communities, and even citizens, which were also forced by the devastating effects of the global market to migrate to the north. The indigenous communities are perceived in this situation as the other. The concept of marginalization, for example, implies a special relationship between the margins and the center that is a point of reference. Zapatismo claims the right of indigenous communities to define their practices, their priorities, and their relationship with the land and natural resources, which are the basis of their collective identity and allows them to create new capacities and a sense of pride and dignity. In contrast to the hegemonic power that seeks to convert land, nature, and labor into pure merchandise, that is not very accessible to many, the Zapatista Autonomy Project is configuring more horizontal and participatory spaces with strategies of inclusive recognition of multiple identities or intersectionality and the creation of new political structures such as the Juntas de Buen Gobierno. The role of international organizations in this problem has been to support indigenous communities in Chiapas as their rights have been violated. This participation can be seen in the following examples. The 1994 outbreak produced a system of international solidarity that meant great support for the Mexican struggle, as its purpose was to guarantee that a warlike solution was not used to contain the rebellion in Chiapas. This transnational network makes information accessible to other various social contexts, validated before local public opinion, and organizes to put pressure on the Mexican government. So even though it is not surprising how Mexico's authorities reacted, there are alternatives that can be considered and implemented to ensure the integration of cultural diversity and the creation of a real climate of equality and equity. For instance, spaces that promote cultural diversity emphasize its importance and allow us to experience it or have this kind of discussions should not only be encouraged but already taking place. Cultural diversity is as necessary for humankind as biodiversity is for nature, and cultural diversity is a route for development. In relation to human rights, cultural diversity is inseparable from respect for human dignity. UNESCO's project of building resilience through the development of intercultural competencies by using story circles is a definite example of the importance of dialogue in addressing complex conflicts. Developing the capacity to deal with cultural diversity helps to create resilience and enables an environment where mutual understanding has a positive impact on our surroundings. As constitutional recognition will not be sufficient to eliminate the persistent inequalities indigenous communities have been facing, the creation and implementation of effective policies that take minorities' necessities into consideration and are based on dialogue between both parties could have better results. In conclusion, some solutions could be implementing programs like story circles or the creation and implementation of effective policies. Most of the concepts we have seen in class can be applied to this specific case. For example, particularism and the need to understand the perspective of the indigenous communities in their own specific cultural and environmental context or historical process. Also about modernization and how different anti-establishment movements are being created because needs are not only not being fulfilled, but they are being denied and human rights are being violated. And finally, about the invisibility of privilege and the normativity of privilege, which also contribute to the otherness created against indigenous communities in this case.